Hello. A survey published last year revealed that 24% of the French population holds anti-Semitic views. The figure for Hungary is 63%. Most shocking of all, in Spain, 72% of the people are willing to admit that they are anti-Jew. Just 70 years after Hitler tried to wipe out European Jewry, attacks on Jews are on the increase. Near Toulouse last year, an Islamist gunman killed 3 young children and their teacher. How worried should we be? What is the cause of this resurgence? What can be done to stop it? Joining me to discuss anti-Semitism in Europe today are Dr Ed Kessler, Director of the Woolf Institute, Mohammed Ansar, who is a social and political commentator who's contributed to Prevent, a government task force on fighting extremism, and Dr Yaakov Wise, Honorary Research Fellow at the Centre for Jewish Studies at the University of Manchester. Yaakov, how would you define anti-Semitism?
Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews and Judaism. And my favourite quote is from a 1920s Hungarian nobleman who said that an anti-Semite is one who hates the Jews more than is necessary.
That's a sort of humorous remark. Do you think it's appropriate in this context of a rise of anti-Semitism?
Well, it's of its time. In the 1920s and the 1930s, it was fashionable to be anti-Semitic. It was fashionable in Britain as well. Jews weren't allowed into golf clubs, into gentlemen's clubs in the West End of London. There were quotas in the universities and in schools like Eton. So you could say it was a semi-humorous remark, but it points to a deeper truth.
Ed, is anti-Semitism on the rise in Europe?
I think on the continent of Europe it really is on the rise. In this country, the number of anti-Semitic incidents actually went down in 2011 from its height in 2009. But certainly if you look at the continent as a whole, there's growth in anti-Semitism.
And Mo, I would guess that social networking has contributed to that.
Well, social networking has been an interesting phenomenon because of the fact that essentially people can go on there and really, to some degree, say absolutely anything and what they like. And what we've seen over the last few years is an increase in far-right activity, which of course has meant more homophobia, Islamophobia, and of course anti-Semitism. We've seen a case recently in France where a Jewish group have taken action against Twitter to try and find information and prosecute some cases of anti-Semitism.
Ed, in popular imagination, anti-Semitism is linked to Christianity, but in fact there are instances that predate Christianity.
Yes, I mean, the obvious example is Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek who tried to ban Judaism in the 2nd century BCE. And if he'd succeeded, of course, there wouldn't just be no Judaism, there'd be no Christianity either.
And Yaakov, some people have pointed to the New Testament and certain parts of it, John's Gospel in particular, and said it's an anti-Semitic text because it points very clearly to the Jews as being responsible for the death of Christ.
Yes, well, the problem the Jews have got is, of course, being first. We were the first people from Abraham, Isaac and Jacob to develop monotheism, the belief in one invisible almighty God. And then several thousand years later comes along Christianity and says the only way to God is through the Son, through the divine Jesus Christ. And the Jews don't go along with this. They don't believe this. Just as 700 years later, they don't go along with Muhammad and they don't go along with the Quran. So both Christianity and Islam are exclusive religions. The only way you get to heaven is by believing in what their texts, their holy scriptures say. And the Jews will not accept that. So, of course, other people develop this theory that the Jews are evil, wicked, refusing to see the light, don't want to be saved, and of course in classical Christian theology are actually responsible for the death of Jesus.
Ed?
I think one of the challenges of reading the New Testament is that it actually is a story about a Jew. And the arguments between Jews are about Jesus, the Jew, and their Jewish arguments over food laws, over circumcision, and so on. So if it is read as an argument between Christians and Jews, as it became when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, you read a completely different story. And that's one of the great dangers of reading the New Testament and seeing it as an anti-Semitic work. I don't think it is. But the danger is how you interpret the text, whether it's biblical, Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, or New Testament, or the Quran itself. But there's a particular danger because the New Testament is primarily about a Jew.
Mo?
I think I'd probably come back on what Yaakov has said in terms of in relation to Islam's relationship to Judaism. Certainly, In Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second chapter of the Quran, which is often considered to be a Quran within itself, the revelation from God is very, very clear, where it states that Jews, Christians, Sabians, and there's an argument about who they are now, or if they even exist, have nothing to fear nor grieve in the next life. And many enlightened and contemporary scholars will look at that verse and consider that to be a complete understanding over the fact that they do have salvation. And so Islam, as opposed to being exclusive, I would say is incredibly inclusive, and that goes some way to describe the relationship with early enlightened Islam and its relationship with its Jewish counterparts.
One of the problems, of course, Mo, is that the Quran is ambivalent. There are those verses, as you say, there are other verses that actually give a very different message. And historically, at the Battle of Khaybar, Muhammad sanctioned the execution of a number of Jews, which has given rise to some Jews saying that Muhammad himself was anti-Semite.
Well, I think that's it's very interesting, and one of the biggest difficulties we have today is coming to a nuanced understanding and an authentic, accurate understanding of what Islam says. There have been many contemporary non-Muslim scholars who have said very clearly that there is nothing anti-Semitic within Islam or Islam's teachings. That's not to say that actions of certain Muslims have not been anti-Semitic, of course, but within Islam we have to draw a distinction and say, well, actually, the actions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are often about politics, are often about land, and are very rarely, I would say, in fact, never around belief.
Well, you mentioned that the behaviour of certain Muslims are not in accordance with the teachings of the Prophet. The same, of course, can be true of Christians. And one of the seminal events was the Crusades. And the first Crusade, Yaakov, when they went to try and save the holy places from the Muslims, what resulted was, in fact, a terrible pogrom on Jews in Hamburg.
Not just Hamburg, but right throughout the Rhineland and Provence and other heavily Jewish populated areas of Europe, and not just through the first crusade, through the second and the third crusades as well. People were killed by the Crusader Knights. Their villages were burnt, women were raped, because these holy knights of Christianity were on the way to the Holy Land to redeem Jerusalem from the infidel. Now, the infidel wasn't the Jew. The infidel was the Muslim rulers of what became Palestine. But because the Jews were local, they were handy, they weren't Christian, so why not kill them as well?
And one of the results, Ed, was the expulsion of Jews really from large parts of Europe and an exodus eastwards, which is why there was such a heavy concentration of Jews in Eastern Europe.
That's right. The first country to expel its Jews was, of course, England in 1290, France in 1304, Spain in 1492, Portugal in 1496, a very sad litany of events. And you're right, Jews not only went east, they were welcomed east into places like Poland, but also into Muslim lands such as Turkey. So the Turkish Jewish community, an eminent community, traces its history back to those expulsions.
Little doubt that the Jews fared much better under Islam than they did under Christianity throughout the Middle Ages. But to move on a little bit, in the late 19th century, the Jews had become stereotyped. Many of the occupations that Christians felt that they couldn't do, like money lending, were taken over by Jews. And so there was a stereotype that the Jews were the people who were greedy, who dealt in money. But in the late 19th century, there began a series of terrible pogroms in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia, Ed.
That's right. The very word pogrom is actually a Russian word and denotes violence and massacres against numbers of Jews. That was the time when Jewish communities began to seek to take power back and not simply be passive recipients of violence and move from one place to another. The rabbis had taught you should be like a reed and not like a cedar. So you move like a reed, whereas a cedar might fall down. But in the late 19th century, things began to change. You had the rise of the nation state in Europe, and Jews began to want to take their own power back, if you like, and that was the beginnings of modern political Zionism.
Out of that particular period, there came a very pernicious document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a pernicious document. Tell me a little bit about that, Yaakov.
Well, it was. It's now believed it was forged by a Tsarist minister in the late 1880s, 1890s, and was promulgated as an excuse or a reason why the Tsarist Empire and some of the other empires in Europe should destroy their Jewish communities and get rid of the Jews or convert them to Christianity. It posits the theory that the Jews conspire to take over the world, to take over the banking system, and to exercise their power, their wicked, evil, sinister power over Christian Europe.
But to me, the interesting thing is the fact that these conspiracy theories still exist. They still float around. You still hear people say that, for instance, 9/11 was all down to a conspiracy between the Jews and the CIA, Ed.
Yes, I think it's a natural human desire for a scapegoat. And because anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism seeped into the culture, particularly of Europe, when you look for a scapegoat, then you choose the other. And the Jews in Europe in that period of time were the only other. There weren't significant numbers of other faith communities, and they became the scapegoat. They became blamed for all the ills, and that's, of course, what Hitler picked up on with the collapse in the economy and the economic chaos in Germany. But he did it on the basis of this history of anti-Judaism.
The Holocaust casts a very long shadow, Mo.
Yeah, it does indeed. And with the rise in Islamophobia in the West, I mean, we have academics all over the world now who are beginning to piece together some of the similarities in rhetoric between 1930s and pre-Nazi anti-Semitism, whether we're talking about minority takeovers or institutions at risk, a fifth column, or as we've seen with Anders Breivik in Oslo recently, attacking the naive left as being a door that becomes open to multiculturalism and other faith groups coming in. And I think some of the lessons we have to learn from history are that when we combine factors like xenophobia with an economic depression, with rising hatred and dissatisfaction with economic policy and foreign policy and immigration, fear, hatred, misunderstanding, misconceptions about religious groups can have a phenomenally worrying and long-lasting effect, especially when we do not, as Ed said, tackle directly some of the rhetoric and some of the arguments that underpin all of this.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing contemporary anti-Semitism. Is hatred of Jews on the rise in Europe? To what extent is it fuelled by the Israel-Palestinian conflict? Are there different sorts of anti-Semitism? And with me are Ed Kessler, Yaakov Wise and Mo Ansar. Elie Petit is the Vice President of the Union of Jewish Students in France. Part of his brief is to monitor any instance of anti-Semitic behaviour. He's getting increasingly anxious.
On the 14th of October, a wave of anti-Semitic tweets are risen. Thousands of tweets with the hashtag #AGoodJew has been posted, and it went on the third most popular trend on Twitter, getting on the homepage, creating an incitement for people to participate in an anti-Semitic contest.
Can you give me a couple of examples of the sort of things that were said on that hashtag?
This hashtag was made to say a good Jew is a dead Jew, a good Jew is a burned Jew, a good Jew is made of ashes, like in Auschwitz, for example, and we decided to react to this wave.
What was Twitter's reaction when you complained about this hashtag?
Twitter never answered, and then we sent them an email. They answered, we made a conference call, and they decided to tell us that they will not touch the tweets, not remove them, unless they have a decision from the justice. They think that American law has to be applied on Twitter, but we think that on Twitter, when it's in French, when it's posted by French people, it is the French law that has to be applied. So we have a different conception about what law has to be applied on this network. American law is a law of unlimited freedom of expression. In France, it's different. The freedom of expression is limited by the time you give messages of hatred.
How did you persuade Twitter to remove the offensive tweets?
We did not have to use big arguments to convince Twitter. They wanted to hear the French law. We gave them the French law, so we prosecuted them for them to be condemned to remove the tweets and give the data of identification of the people that posted these tweets.
The examples you gave me of the sort of tweets that appeared under that hashtag were really deeply offensive, deeply anti-Semitic. What did you read into that? Do you think there's been an increase in anti-Semitism in France?
Yes, since last March. In March in Toulouse, a killer, Mohammed Ansar, decided to go in a Jewish school and killed 3 children and a teacher. So this anti-Semitic attack was the beginning of an anti-Semitic wave in France, in the speech and in the acts. When you say a good Jew is a dead Jew, you also talk about what happened in March in Toulouse.
And I understand that there have been examples of people who supported his actions in France and thought that he was a hero.
Yeah. Yesterday, the Minister of Interior gave a statement about the liberation of hateful speech in France after the killing by Mohammed Merah. It's been obvious that it has liberated the speech of glorification of his actions.
What impact did those killings and the tweets have on the Jewish community in France?
The Jewish community is worried, sometimes afraid. People are afraid. They sometimes think about leaving France, and it creates a decline in the trust that we have in the country.
That was Elie Petit. Ed, the tweets were extremely nasty and virulent. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't, I'm afraid. I think there is a fundamental problem with the social media, and particularly the anonymous nature of it, that you can say anything to anybody without declaring who you are. And it's interesting, on the Google website, there is a disclaimer if you type in the word Jew, because of the offensive websites that will follow.
Mohi links it with the shootings in Toulouse, where 3 children and a rabbi were killed by a Muslim extremist.
Yeah, I think firstly, beyond the killings, social media has such a phenomenally important role to play in tackling hate crimes and anti-Semitism. And I met earlier this week with a representative from Twitter looking specifically at anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and with a Jewish group. And it's very, very concerning that this idea that freedom of expression should somehow include hate speech, which, of course, all reasonably minded people would think that should not include hate speech.
Yaakov?
You know what? I'm not so much concerned about Twitter and social media as I am about the rise in street crime. You've got more chance of being physically attacked for being a Jew in Greater Manchester than you have anywhere else in the United Kingdom.
How do you account for that?
Because we've got a very large concentration of visibly Orthodox Jews, all living in a continuous area, the southern area of Bury and the northern area of Salford. And we've got 15, 16, 17,000 people walking around in traditional Jewish clothing, black hats and long beards and long black coats. And we are surrounded by very, very economically deprived white working class and Asian working class districts, and people come in deliberately to attack Jews, to insult them, to abuse them, and sometimes to assault them. And what's even more worrying is, of course, we're developing our own homegrown terrorists. A Muslim couple from Oldham were convicted last year of plotting to blow up Jewish institutions in Manchester.
Well, you see, that brings it back to Muslims, you see. And Mo, I just wonder, is there a sense in which young people within the Muslim community are being fed a diet of anti-Semitism?
We are getting reports regularly of Muslims, and I have a friend who works in East London who contacted me. She works with Muslim youth groups, and she said, Mohammed, look, we have a difficulty with young people who conflate Jews and Judaism with Zionism and Israeli foreign policy. And the question was asked, what can we do to try and counter that extremist narrative, that misunderstanding? And this is about better education of Islam, a better understanding of interfaith tolerance and cohesive working.
But Ed, this does raise the issue of the Israeli-Palestine conflict and how much that colours people's view of Jews in particular.
It does, and in this country, the highest instance of anti-Semitic attacks occurred during the Gaza-Israel war in 2009, when you had nearly 1,000 incidents. So it is one of those spike moments. Now, it's very easy to, under the guise of criticism of Israel, to be anti-Semitic. At the same time, it's very easy to be oversensitive to criticism of Israel if you're a supporter of Israel, of whatever faith you might belong to. There's every reason why Jews might be paranoid, but that's not a good enough reason to be paranoid. We've talked about the history of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, but the bottom line is, We have to be able to have a reasoned discourse about Israel-Palestine, to be able to criticize actions of the Israeli government without the Jewish community feeling very defensive and shouting anti-Semitism. And at the same time, people who talk about it have to lead that conversation with sensitivity to those sorts of issues. Because if you have comments and questions, as I occasionally have had, and Mo maybe also, why do you Jews treat the Palestinians as the Nazis treated the Jews? I mean, that statement is packed with not just anti-Semitic rhetoric, but such ignorance, which is why the work of Mo or my own work or Yaakov is so important in teaching people about what anti-Semitism is and what it's not.
But Yaakov, it does seem that it's very difficult to criticise the Israeli government without in turn being told that you're being anti-Semitic. And some people would say that Jews see anti-Semitism everywhere.
Yes, they tend to be Americans, actually, rather than European Jews, who I think are probably a bit more realistic about, and of course have got a lot more experience of living with anti-Semitism. But the old joke, they say, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not really out to get you. We have to have, as Ed says, a political discourse about British foreign policy, about Israeli policy towards the Palestinians and the occupied territories, without, as we say, conflating that with Jews. All Jews are not Zionists, and certainly British Jews are not Israelis. They are British citizens. My family have lived in Britain since 1882. Now, when people shout at me at the street, go back to where you came from, and I shout back, what do you mean, Bury? What are they talking about? Where do they think we come from? We are British Jews born and brought up in Britain who have lived here for generations. What has that got to do with the foreign policy of a Netanyahu government in Israel? Nothing. We have no effect on them. We have no influence. We don't have a vote in Israel. We have a vote in a British general election. What's that got to do with us? Why are you attacking us for that?
No.
I think it's really important to recognise also that, as well as making the distinction in this country and in the West about the distinction between Zionism, Israeli foreign policy, and Judaism and Jews, this distinction is also being made in the Middle East, in the Arab territories. We have somebody who's been considered a very controversial Muslim scholar in the West, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who goes to great lengths to ensure that people have a nuanced understanding and saying, if you have a difficulty with Israeli foreign policy, if you have a difficulty with military occupations, this is something distinct from Judaism and Jews. And so regardless of many of his other statements, I think it's really important that wherever we work, we continue to make this distinction.
Ed?
Alongside that, and this is something I think many of my Muslim and Christian students find difficulty with, there is an element of peoplehood to Judaism. There is an element of an attachment to a particular piece of real estate, the size of Wales. And so you have this connection. As much as, my local corner store are Sikhs and they have a particular connection with Amritsar and that part of India. So there is a connection between Jews and that land. There is. As much as there is a religion of Judaism and a culture of Judaism, there is a peoplehood of Judaism, and it's complicated. And so your language of nuance is absolutely right. And it's when we don't nuance, we make these stereotypes, and if you start using the definite article, the Jews, you'll say the Muslims, you're likely to come out with something negative. And it's being aware of the complexity of that. And then, by unpacking it, we can begin to overcome and tackle it.
Would you agree, Ed, that most anti-Semitism doesn't have its origins in Islamist thinking?
Absolutely. There is a strand, and that's something that I think the Muslim communities are aware of. But most anti-Semitism actually comes out of this normal xenophobic rhetoric, which is anti-Muslim, which is anti-gay, and even can be misogynist.
No.
What interests me is that there are contemporary writers like Norman Finkelstein, whatever you think about his policies and his personal views, they raise some really interesting issues, which is that young Jews have got far less affinity with the nation state of Israel and Israeli foreign policy than ever before, and they're seeing huge moves away from the support of Israel in places like the United States and Europe.
I think there's a really interesting point, which is the cross-generational dysfunctionality. You're quite right that the younger generation, my kids, are feeling increasingly disaffected with Israel and the politics of Israel, which is a major shift, and that will have huge ramifications within Judaism that we will see in the next generation.
I want to just raise a couple of contemporary issues that have hit the headlines fairly recently. One was recent attempts, for instance, in Germany to declare that circumcision of young children is illegal. What do you make of that, Ed? Are you alarmed at that?
Well, I was very alarmed when it first came out, but quite quickly it was challenged and overcome. So it was a local court in Cologne which made this decision, which I found very bizarre, and I know many of my Muslim colleagues also found very odd. But to the credit of that country and that government, it was challenged and it was overcome.
That went away very quickly. There was also in Holland a ban on kosher and halal slaughter, which, Yaakov, I guess is rather more serious nature.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, it does have echoes of the 1930s. Virtually the first anti-Jewish measure taken by the Nazis when they were elected to the Reichstag in 1933 was to ban religious slaughter. And that was, of course, taken up by all the occupied countries of Europe during the war. But ironically, I think that's, in a way, something positive, because it's an issue, both male circumcision and religious slaughter, that Jews and Muslims have in common. And that's an area where we can work closely together.
I want to ask each one of you a final question. What would you identify as the main danger posed to the world by resurgent anti-Semitism in Europe, Ed?
Well, if Jews are the target, then other people will follow. Other minorities, Muslims, Christians in other parts of the world. So if Jews are targeted, we are all targeted.
Mo?
With the rising economic disaffection, with swinging cuts taking place, with the rise of the far right, as we've seen in Germany and in Greece and other places, I think we have the prospect of a dark cloud falling over Europe again if we are not able at this juncture to nip some of these issues in the bud. And I think it's going to be absolutely essential that different religious groups, activists, community organisations and governments come together and have a very, very frank dialogue about how we stop the rise of far-right anti-Semitic and Islamophobic rhetoric and activity.
Yaakov?
Well, as John Mann, the chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Committee on Anti-Semitism, always says, anti-Semitism is not a problem for the Jews, it's a problem for society in general. It breeds hatred, it breeds cruelty, it breeds racism, and unless that's stopped and unless the education process is improved, then it's going to make Europe a much worse place than it has been in the past.
Well, that's all for this week. My thanks to Yaakov Wise, Mohammed Ansar and Ed Kessler. I'll be back again next week with another edition of Beyond Belief. I hope you'll join me.